Hello, welcome everyone, and thank you for coming today. My name is Will Snell. I'm the Chief Executive of the Fairness Foundation, and I'm delighted to be joined at this webinar by David Ley-Williams, Professor of Political Science at DePaul University and affiliate at the University of Chicago's Stone Center for Research on Wealth, Inequality and Mobility, by Karen Rowlingson, Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences and Professor of Social Policy at the University of York, and by Luke Kemp, Research Affiliate at the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge. We often frame societal risks in terms of immediate visible threats, pandemics, climate disasters, or geopolitical conflicts. Yet one of humanity's most persistent dangers, economic inequality, rarely occupies the same urgency in public discourse. David's compelling book, The Greatest of All Plagues: How Economic Inequality Shaped Political Thought from Plato to Marx, challenges this oversight by uncovering an important truth that for over 2 millennia, some of the West's greatest minds have sounded alarms about concentrated wealth's corrosive effects on society. From Plato's warning that inequality creates two cities, to Adam Smith's fear that vast income gaps erode mutual sympathy between classes, some of history's sharpest thinkers have identified economic disparity as an existential threat to justice, democracy, and human flourishing. David, Karen, and Luke are going to discuss what we can learn from the past about the threat of economic inequality, why philosophers considered it so disruptive and destabilizing, and how we can make this threat more tangible to provoke action today. And David's going to start with a summary of some of the key arguments in his book, followed by some responses from both Karen and Luke. And then we'll turn over to audience Q&A, and there should be plenty of time for questions before we finish at 6 p.m. sharp UK time. So please submit your questions using the Q&A function on Zoom. The sooner the better, and you can also upvote other people's questions. Without further ado, I'm going to turn over to you, David. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Will, and thank you to everyone at the Fairness Foundation for inviting me for this transatlantic talk. I wrote The Greatest of All Plagues with a few ambitions. At first, I wanted to alert readers to the fact that we're hardly the first people to identify and grapple with inequality as a problem. Not only has inequality been around from the beginning of recorded history, but smart people have identified it as a problem all along. My book starts with Plato, from whom the title has been adapted. Technically speaking, Plato's Athenian stranger in his last and longest dialogue, The Laws, identified civil war as, quote, the greatest of all plagues. But in so doing, he immediately qualifies it this way. He says that to avoid that plague of civil war, quote, then neither harsh poverty nor wealth should exist among any of his citizens. For both these conditions breed both civil war and faction. Although Plato was the first major Western philosopher to understand economic inequality in such catastrophic terms, he was hardly the last. Second, I wanted, in writing this book, to demonstrate that this concern about inequality seems to transcend first principles, which is to say, that whatever one's larger moral, political, and even sometimes religious ambitions, especially these thinkers that I discuss, significant inequality poses serious obstacles to achieving those goals and those principles. This is true in Plato's quest of civic harmony. It's true in Jesus's advocacy of loving God and loving one's neighbors. It's true in Thomas Hobbes' quest for peace. It's true in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's pursuit of the general will. It's true in Adam Smith's ambition of mutual sympathy. And it's true in John Stuart Mill's pursuit of utility. And it's also true in Marx's quest to free people from domination. Whatever these thinkers and figures seem to want, broad economic inequality stands in the way. Third, and relatedly, I argue that any comprehensive political theory will have to take account of inequality and its potential effects, because inequality can interfere with political regimes on so many different dimensions that we'll discuss in a few minutes. It's difficult to imagine doing political theory without addressing the threats that it poses and the benefits of maintaining some degree of equality. Fourth, and related to this last point, all of these thinkers challenge much common sense, or what passes for common sense today among economists, philosophers, journalists, and public intellectuals. Namely, if they're right, namely the authors that I write about in this book, the historical thinkers, they undermine a popular philosophy today known sometimes as sufficientarianism, the doctrine that while poverty is a problem, inequality is not. This includes people like the journalist Tyler Cowen, the economist Deirdre McCloskey, the journalist David Brooks, although he seems to be evolving recently, the academic Steven Pinker, the philosopher Harry Frankfurt, and the like. For them, they all think that poverty, while poverty deprives citizens of essential needs, and political communities have some obligation to do something about it, attention at the other end of the economic spectrum, namely concentrated wealth, is unwarranted from their perspective and even morally dubious. As Deirdre McCloskey has insisted, quote, what matters ethically is that the poor have a roof over their heads and they have enough to eat. Equalizing the possession of Rolexes does not, end quote. Indeed, McCloskey goes so far as to claim that concern about the concentration of wealth reveals a deep moral vice, namely the vice of envy. Relatedly, Steven Pinker has argued that concern about inequality is nothing less than spiteful envy, an unfortunate tendency among the less successful to demonize the achievers amongst them. Rather than a source of envy, he advises that inequality should be viewed among the poor as a harbinger of opportunity, an inspiration to all to achieve what our wealthy neighbors have themselves accumulated through their intelligence and hard work. If this is true, then it applies to many of the thinkers that McCloskey and Pinker themselves profess to admire, such as Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill and Jesus, among others, who worry not only about poverty, but also the effects of concentrated wealth at the top of the economic hierarchy, which is to say, then maybe for them, what's motivating people like Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill and Jesus is more envy than real analysis. And I'm going to say more about that in a little bit. The figures I address in this book offer many and varied reasons why inequality is a problem beyond the deprivation of basic needs for the poorest in unequal societies. As compelling as that is, since there's more consensus that poverty is a problem that demands remedies. I want to sketch out a small handful of reasons why inequality and concentrated wealth is a problem according to these historical figures I discuss in the book. And then perhaps later in discussion, we can talk a little bit about what they thought could be done about inequality, how we might try to repair and restore potentially a greater degree of equality. I'm going to talk about the problems as these folks have identified it by kind of clustering them together rather than doing them thinker by thinker. So I'm going to do this in 4 broad categories of problems that they've identified. These problems are at 4 levels specifically: the personal level, the moral level, the social level, and the political level. And I want to say before I start talking about these that I don't read too much into the separation of these categories. There's a lot of blending amongst them. So don't get too wrapped up in making fine distinctions here. Along the way here, I'll also draw from the various figures I discuss in the book. So I'll start with number 1, the personal problems. So I'll start with personal and work my way to the political. But how does inequality affect people personally? I don't think it's hard to understand how inequality affects the poor, right? Most obviously, when a society has abundant resources but allocates very little of that to the poor obviously struggle to meet basic needs. This much has been known forever, right? It's a major theme in my chapter on the New Testament, but certainly not just that. There's a reason why Jesus was celebrated in his day for feeding the poor and healing their illnesses. They needed help. But what's interesting is that basic needs are hardly the only traditional concern about the personal problems of the poor amongst the figures I discussed in this book. So Thomas Hobbes, for example, laments, quote, what grieves and discontents the human spirit more than anything else is poverty or want of the essential for the preservation of life and dignity. So poverty for him was a problem, yes, of want and needs, but it was also a blow to the dignity of the poor. But more than this, when we get to someone like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who takes into consideration some of the psychic effects of the emerging doctrine of meritocracy amidst inequality, the poor are increasingly viewed as responsible for their poverty, right? Whereas in the feudal period, the poor understood their poverty to be largely ascriptive. In the commercial age, in the age of capitalism, their poverty was increasingly attributed to their own personal failings, their intelligence and their efforts, their industry. Colloquially, right, as Americans like to say sometimes, they're poor because they're stupid and lazy, which is a very heavy psychological burden to impose on the poor, one that Rousseau explores and Marx will later outline in Das Kapital as an essential assumption in capitalist economies. It's less intuitive that the rich would also suffer from inequality, but starting with Plato, there are repeated warnings about the fact that the rich won't enjoy their lives nearly as much as they might hope. This is because they're typically consumed by what the Greeks called pleonexia, an insatiable and unrelenting greed for wealth. Plato likens pleonexia in his Gorgias to a leaky jug. No matter how much water one pours into the jug, it keeps needing and wanting more. The book of Ecclesiastes in the Bible discusses pleonexia in rich detail in the metaphor of chasing the wind. It is the unhappy pursuit of something that can never be captured. This concept continues to animate and inform many others later in the tradition, including Hobbes, John Stuart Mill, and Marx. In all cases, this condition of pleonexia found amongst the rich is deeply problematic. For Plato, pleonexia is a disease of the soul. For John Stuart Mill, the pleonectic are akin to a spoiled child who's always dissatisfied. So while the rich never have to worry about meeting their basic needs, as the poor are, they are often very needy people all the same, unhappily so. Of course, it's one thing to be unhappy. It's another thing to be bad or evil. Yet the history of political thought repeatedly teaches that the wealthiest citizens are often among the worst citizens. Insofar as the rich suffer from pleonexia, for Plato, they become terrible people. In his laws, Plato's Athenian stranger repeatedly insists that it's impossible that those who become very rich also become good. All four of Plato's most cherished moral virtues are undermined by the concentration of wealth. Insofar as their souls are ruled by the lust of greater fortunes, they're intemperate and unjust. Insofar as they fear losing their fortunes, they lack courage. Insofar as they presume to know more than they really do, they lack wisdom. And we find these themes weaving their way through many other thinkers in the book. I think that's enough to say about that for now. Let me move on to talk about the social effects of inequality. It should be obvious that many of the effects I've already described as personal and moral bleed over into the social and political realms. So suffice it to say, everyone I discuss in my book is worried about the social effects of inequality. Rousseau makes the connection between the personal and social effects very explicit. The wealthiest people for him in unequal societies take a special pleasure in dominating others. And once they understand this about themselves, once they know that domination gives them pleasure, they come to find pleasure in nothing else. According to Rousseau, quote, like those ravenous wolves, which once they've tasted human flesh, scorn all other food, and from then on want only to devour men. Such are the wealthy, according to Rousseau. Rousseau may be the most dramatic, but others are hardly subtle about this either. For Adam Smith, the social problem with inequality is that it systematically robs the rich from feeling anything for the poor. They become incapable of empathizing with them, and hence cannot understand why anyone would want to help them. I mean, just along these lines, you might have read the news over here that Elon Musk said that empathy is the problem with Western civilization, right? People feel too much for the poor. He would like people to feel less for the poor. And I think this pretty perfectly encapsulates the problems that concern people like Rousseau and Adam Smith. But beyond these characters, there are other social problems. John Stuart Mill, for example, speaks of a concealed enmity and a soured animosity that characterizes the relations between the classes, right? And one hardly needs to mention Marx, other than to say that for him, class antagonism is what the kids call a feature and not a bug of inequality and capitalistic systems. So finally, I'll take a quick look at some of the political effects of inequality, and then I'll turn things over to others. Concerns about political effects of inequality are found also all throughout the text that I write about. As I've already suggested, in the very title of my book, The Greatest of All Plagues, it was Plato's own term for the inevitable political fate of radically unequal societies, namely civil war. Hobbes similarly viewed civil war, or a return to the state of nature, as he called it, to be the likely result from too much economic inequality. Rousseau's discourse on the origins of inequality is largely about a civil war that takes place between rich and poor. And again, of course, Marx's thoughts on the matter are very well known. I need not say anything about that. But there are even more subtle effects than this, right? Somewhere short of civil war is a capture of political power and public policy by the rich to serve their own interests. John Stuart Mill called this class legislation. Today, we might actually use Plato's term for this, which is oligarchy. But there's certainly an overwhelming consensus among these thinkers in addressing inequality that at the very least, in unequal societies, the rich will seize the bulk of the political power, right? As I think we're seeing happen in many unequal countries these days, and I think we all worry, or many people worry these days about what kind of the ultimate effects of this are, and are Plato and Marx right that if we continue to expand inequality and promote and pursue the interests of the oligarchs, will that make political dissolution inevitable? That we wait to see still. So I'm going to stop now. I haven't said anything about what these folks wanted to do about inequality, but I figured that will come up later, and I'll cede to the next in the queue.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. Karen, over to you.
Thanks very much, David. And first of all, I just wanted to commend David on an absolutely fascinating book, focusing on what the traditional canon of Western political thought have said about the harm caused by the concentration of wealth. As David has just outlined, he talks about how the traditional philosophers have looked at wealth inequality causing a range of harms, including on the moral character of the rich and on society more generally, on social division, on an unfair excess of political and economic power, and ultimately on civil and class war. Much of this, sadly, resonates with where we are today, as we see increasing wealth inequality leading to social polarization, and indeed, I would argue, the growth of fascism, albeit in potentially new forms. And of course, more traditional wars between countries can also be a symptom of inequality, as elites seek to hold on to their position by uniting different groups in their own countries against a common external enemy. Some of the arguments set out in the traditional Western canon are also still very much alive today, as again David alluded to earlier. And I know that the Fairness Foundation held an event last year with Ingrid Robbins, a philosopher at Utrecht University, who's coined the term limitarianism to capture the idea that we should actually put, thanks David, we should actually put limits on excessive wealth, in contrast to the doctrine of sufficientarianism that David has also just outlined. She bases this argument on very much some of these ideas that are in David's book from the more traditional canon, on the impact of wealth inequality on social division, on democracy, on productivity in terms of negative outcomes, and on poverty, but also on the mental and physical health outcomes for people in unequal countries. And indeed, she also looks at the impact of inequality on climate change, given that the rich are by far the biggest polluters in the world. The work of philosophers in this space is heavily informed, of course, by empirical researchers, including my own University of York colleagues, Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, whose work on the spirit level has been hugely influential in setting out the impact of inequality on a range of outcomes. And this work has been updated recently with its 15th anniversary last year, again highlighting new work around the links between inequality and climate change. A key question for me is I'm not a philosopher, I'm a professor of social policy. So a key question for me is why, despite the many centuries worth of argument and also particularly more recent empirical evidence, are we where we are now, witnessing such a staggering level of wealth concentrated in so few hands and causing such great harm? A key part of the answer here surely has to be this vicious circle between the concentration of economic wealth and the concentration of political power. The wealthy have power to influence government, and indeed, we've mentioned Elon Musk already, many have the wealth to become political leaders themselves and then change laws and introduce policies that benefit them and other wealthy people, and so the vicious circle continues. After a period of declining inequality following the Second World War in the UK, we saw this circle begin in the 1980s with cuts to taxation and the welfare state, and laws that reduce the power of trade unions and collective bargaining, thus ushering in the growing inequality that has occurred from then on. As well as influencing economic and political change, the wealthy also have the power to shape and determine dominant discourses through influence on or even direct ownership of different forms of media. And this enables the wealthy to perpetuate a moral economy discourse, the myth of meritocracy, as David discusses in the book, which suggests that the rich are generally deserving because they work hard and contribute more to society through their efforts and their taxes, whereas the poor, again, David mentioned this earlier, according to the discourse, are generally seen as less deserving and contribute less. Not everyone buys into this discourse, of course, and there's still the possibility for challenging it further. I know the Fairness Foundation has done some of that work. I'd just also like to point to the work of Katarina Hecht at Northeastern University, who's currently doing some empirical work on this, linking public views on the deservingness of the rich to public support for policy change. For example, if the public think that some rich people are undeserving because they're spending their money very lavishly on lots of luxuries, then we might see more support for taxes on luxuries, which is an idea that Rousseau, for example, supported and is covered in David's book. In terms of how we might tackle wealth inequality more generally, again, David's book does touch on a number of suggestions made by the traditional canon, including estate or inheritance taxes, worker cooperatives, a ban on interest-bearing loans, debt jubilees, and so on. And these are also policy areas that are discussed today. But again, the puzzle for me is why we haven't done more here, particularly now in the UK when we have a Labour government. To be fair to Labour, perhaps there have been some changes in relation to inheritance tax rules, closing loopholes, for example, around farms, which they appear to be standing by, even though there's been some very public opposition from some farmers. And they're also making changes to non-dom tax status, though this seems to be largely continuing the policy of the previous Conservative government. So it's hardly radical change in the face of the level of wealth inequality we see in the UK, and given the need to find resources to maintain vital public services. It's so hard to understand why the Labour government is cutting winter fuel payments and disability benefits when there are large untaxed reserves of excessive wealth to draw on. And there is actually more support for this among the general public than is sometimes feared by politicians. Of course, Labour MPs are divided on this, and some have written powerfully about the case to reduce wealth inequality. And I'm thinking particularly here of Liam Byrne, but there are many others. I want to say a little bit more about the causes of wealth inequality, and I've already mentioned the role of changes in law and policy. But David's book, particularly his chapter on Marx, of course, reviews the deeper structural causes. And indeed, his chapter on Hobbes mentions how the East India Company, founded in 1600, earned 500% returns for a handful of small investors by extracting wealth from the Indian subcontinent. And in the chapter on Adam Smith, he points out that Glasgow's wealth in the 18th century was very largely built on the transatlantic slave trade, which Adam Smith was well aware of and opposed to. And then we come back to Karl Marx, of course, who talked about, quotes, the conquest, enslavement, robbery, murder, in short, force used to accumulate and extract wealth. For those who might want to understand more about wealth extraction from global south to global north through colonialism, I'd strongly recommend the work of Sussex University professor Gurminder Bambra. And of course, we still see the impact of this on racial wealth inequality today within the UK and other countries like the US. And again, there's a wealth of literature and research that we can go into further. Coming back to Marx, for him, violence was not just a tool used between countries to extract wealth, but also within countries, again, this is covered well in David's book, to steal the commonwealth and exploit the proletariat with devastating consequences for that group. And we can also see this in the history of the time during the 18th century in the UK, when over 200 crimes became punishable by death, particularly property crimes, including stealing sheep, poaching fish, damaging property. And then towards the end of that century, we had the Combination Acts, which criminalised combining or organising together to gain better working conditions, with the toll puddle martyrs in the UK being transported to Australia for so doing. Much of the traditional canon, including Marx, of course, focused particularly on social divisions based on different notions of class. And I've very briefly mentioned the importance of racial wealth inequalities, so I just want to briefly mention gender wealth inequalities. And I remember going back a number of decades now at university, reading Frederick Engels' book on the origin of the family, private property and the state, which has quite a lot to say about this. But of course, there's also a large body of feminist literature on patriarchy and its linked with capitalism. And more recently, I'd recommend an empirical book on the gender of capital by Céline Bessière and Sybille Golac for those interested to explore this area further. So I'd just like to close now and once again commend David on his impressive work, which rightly provokes further debate on the harms caused by the concentration of wealth, but also on the causes of that concentration and how we can tackle wealth inequality, the greatest of all plagues. And now I think I'm handing over to Luke.
Wonderful. Thank you, Karen. Luke, over to you.
Thank you, Will. And first of all, like Karen, I'd like to congratulate David on the fascinating and much needed book. And secondly, I'd like to apologize for the ethereal ever, which I'm presenting from. Hope it's not too distracting. Now, David's done a fantastic job of covering much of the philosophical discourse around inequality. And interestingly, it is heavily supported by empirical observations as well. So both Karen and David have spoken about this myth of meritocracy, the classic defense that's offered by people like Pinker. It's pretty easy to pull apart as soon as you realize that every single billionaire under the age of 30 inherited their wealth. What up? And similarly, this idea that people who are rich start to lack certain virtues actually does have some evidence behind it as well. There's a growing body of literature in both neuroscience and psychology around how power corrupts. And this can be surprisingly dramatic. So if you put people in a position of power and then you scan their brains, you actually find that the parts of the brains responsible for mirroring, so subconsciously copying someone else's behaviors, their facial expressions, it's a way of building empathy connection. Those are actually inhibited. And across this body of literature, you find that in general, people who have a lot of power, which of course overlaps strongly with having a lot of wealth, tend to be more likely to cheat in their spouses, more likely to cheat in games, have less empathy, compassion, less risk adversity, and just overall tend to be not that great. So even for that kind of much more abstract idea of a lack of virtue, there's growing evidence for that. And perhaps the area where there's most kind of growing empirical basis is the connection between civil war, state crisis and state collapse, and inequality. So Plato made an observation without a huge amount of data, but now we do have that. And it's turning up the very resounding conclusion that inequality is the main driver behind societal crisis and collapse. So one of the main ideas here is originally pioneered by Jack Goldstone, but then has been heavily kind of refined by Peter Turchin, as well as Dan Hoyer, who've looked across dozens of historical cases and more or less come to the conclusion that what lies behind them are usually two factors, both of which are driven by inequality. Essentially, as wealth inequality increases over time, what tends to happen is you get a kind of wealth pump which moves wealth from the bottom of society, the laborers, up towards the top, the owners of capital. And that slowly impoverishes people. And it doesn't take too much to look at either the UK or the US and look at both rising housing prices and cost of living crises to see that potentially we're seeing exactly the same thing happen today. Alongside popular administration, you have a second problem, which is you start to get more and more elites. As you get growing wealth inequality and society becomes more kind of top heavy, you start to get a larger number of elites competing for high status positions. And eventually that can often result in generals conducting coups, or as Karen mentioned, rich people basically getting involved in politics or using xenophobia to essentially rally some part of the impoverished population to their cause. And those two tend to coalesce into creating some kind of crisis. Crisis can eventually devolve into something even more dramatic, what we usually refer to as societal collapse, when most of the key power structures in a society fall apart. And when you look at that movement from crisis to collapse, other factors come into play, which also are driven by inequality. So, for instance, when people think about collapse, they often think about external threats or shocks, things like climate change. And yet, different societies responded very differently to similar climatic shocks. So some of the best work here has been done by Peter Peregrine at Yale University. He took a wide selection of societies during the Little Ice Age and other periods across history and looked at how much temperature they experienced and how much did they actually change. Was there a large amount of depopulation? Were there assassinations, etc.? And the key conclusion he came to was that while there was a kind of general correlation between temperature change and social change, that didn't always hold up. And what seemed to create social resilience was having more inclusive democratic societies. And similarly, when you start to look at findings from disaster risk resilience from the modern world, it seems that societies which are more equal and have more democratic institutions tend to weather the storm much more effectively, whether that be terrorist attacks, hurricanes, earthquakes, etc. So there's a growing body of evidence that basically more inclusive institutions and more equal ones tend to also be more resilient ones. And part of this seems to be something which David mentioned, oligarchy. When you have a small number of people who are already corrupted by power and have a vested interest in the status quo, they're usually not very good at addressing oncoming problems, particularly when the oncoming problems require a change in the status quo. Beyond that, even on a very abstract level, we have this growing body of evidence that when it comes to making good collective judgments, you want to have a group of diverse people who deliberate and share information. This is clear across collective intelligence, forecasting, foresight. In short, whenever we actually try to make a good prediction of the future or make good judgment in general, whether it's be in the IPCC or even intelligence agencies, we rely upon essentially equals in a diverse group exchanging information. And yet when it comes to corporations and governments, we do exactly the opposite. We essentially lean into inequality and autocracy. Alongside that, as you get larger amounts of inequality, we also know from modern day studies, you tend to get more corruption, which makes a lot of sense, of course. If you have more wealth inequality, there's going to be more opportunities to be corrupt, to exploit the system. And that doesn't even count legalized corruption, like, for instance, basically buying elections, as we recently seen. So you have all of these different factors that slowly come into play, whether it be corruption, elite competition, or elite factionalism, as I prefer to call it, immiseration. And beyond that, inequality just seems to be naturally bad for our societies. So Karen earlier mentioned the spirit level, and there's also the other book, the inner level, both of which just make a very strong empirical case that as a species that's developed and evolved 300,000 years in a condition of equality, inequality tends to be corrosive to us. It causes high rates of teenage pregnancy, high rates of interpersonal violence. Essentially, every form of both social and mental ill tends to be worsened by it. So all of these factors are the kind of different blows that tend to make societies more fragile and more vulnerable to collapse. And all of them are driven by inequality. And as one final word, in my line of work, we often talk about existential risks, the biggest crises and risks we face today, things like climate change, nuclear weapons, etc. And once again, when we peel out the layer there, there's wealth inequality. I think Karen mentioned in brief that emissions are very highly tied to wealth inequality. So the top 1% globally emit roughly 16.7% of global emissions. the top 10% emit roughly 48% of global emissions. Similarly, if you're looking at nuclear weapons, the first nuclear weapons made for both Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the Trinity test all basically involved exploited labor from mines in the Congo, in particular the Shinkolobwe mine. And today, if you worry about AI, for instance, or killer robots, that all requires essentially mined cobalt from the Congo and other areas. So there's these long chains of extraction inequality which feed into an overarching system which produces risk. And until you address that underlying inequality, it's not just going to be civil war. It could be something far, far worse. So once again, thank you, David. And I look forward to the further discussion.
Great. Thank you, Luke. David, I'd like to give you a chance to respond to Karen and Luke's reflections and to focus on anything you'd like to. But among other things, to abuse my chair's privilege, would be interested in your thoughts on the solutions that the thinkers in your book have outlined. You mentioned having sort of skipped over that part in your opening remarks. So it would be great to hear your thoughts on that, including to Karen's notion of this vicious circle of economic and political inequality, and any further reflections on both the causes of inequality as outlined in the book, and also on the Peter Turchin theory that Luke outlined.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for these wonderful comments. And I feel like we share a certain understanding of what's at stake in the massive growth of inequality in the last few decades. So starting with Karen's comments first, my takeaway that the really big question that I think she posed is a profound one, which is, why is it that we continue to arrange the social and economic order so unequally, despite the repeated warnings of the canon, over thousands of years? Why do we keep making the same mistake? Of course, this wouldn't be the only area in which we make mistakes. Again, in spite of warnings, Americans now are, confronting real questions about, why do we seem to be pursuing an authoritarian regime, in spite of the warning of people even in living memory who had to go fight Nazis on the continent. This is also a stunning question for which I think many struggle to come up with a good answer. But let me give it a shot, and I'll start my answer by referencing an American scholar by the name of Jeffrey Winters, who teaches at Northwestern University. He's a political scientist. He wrote a book called Oligarchy about 10, 15 years ago. And in his book, he makes a pretty compelling case for the reason that we struggle to change in spite of a growing awareness of the problems associated with inequality and oligarchy. And that is something he calls, he's dubbed the wealth defense industry, WDI. Namely that rich people are very good at holding on to and even growing their wealth, right? In kind of the most immediate sense, right? They hire money managers who are very good at making more money out of the money that they have, right? But that's really only the bare foundation of it. What they do beyond this, of course, is to spend money in other ways, which is often manifested in a political influence, right? By as some people say, right, by buying politicians, right, buying their interests, right. I don't know if this made the news in the UK, but maybe it did when Donald Trump was inaugurated in January. On the podium with him was a collection of several of the wealthiest people in the world, all of whom were tripping over one another to give him money for his inauguration fund, but also it's being used for other purposes, right? But mainly, of course, to buy influence, right? And we could, this was a less subtle form of something, of course, that's been going on for a very long time. It's not unique to American Republicans by any means. Democratic politicians have also taken money from many of the same people, right? And policies that would really do something significant about inequality never actually seem to get implemented. The one temporary exception to this, of course, was the COVID period in which there was an overwhelming, compelling reason to redistribute resources to people who couldn't work anymore. But we seem to be beyond that, and we seem to be pursuing yet greater inequality these days. So the wealth defense industry is certainly a big part of it, but at a deeper level, what underlies that, of course, are many of the issues that are discussed by the philosophers in this book, right? At a very deep psychic level, right? Greed, right? Seems to be, well, I should say, there's disagreement among the philosophers I discussed, whether it's built into human nature or whether it's something that we learn by virtue of living in unequal societies. But at any rate, greed is certainly pervasive, and it leads the wealthiest, who are much better at protecting their interests than others, to continue promoting still greater inequality. Regarding Luke's comments, I mean, yes, I don't have any problems with what Luke said. I think the most provocative of his comments is whether inequality drives societal collapse. And I think there's a very plausible argument for that. I think, as it's manifested, I think particularly in the inability of Western countries to do much of anything about the environment, right? As wealthy interests become increasingly entrenched and inequality continues to grow, there seems to be no real interest in doing anything about this, which we can predict is going to create problems that we will no longer be well situated to solve. Problems of being able to make enough food for people, problems of overwhelming natural and repeated natural disasters of the sort that are going to create truly massive problems. If there's any upside, and I don't want to say there's a big upside to societal collapse, there is a book by Walter Scheidel. He's an historian at Stanford University, called The Great Leveling. And interestingly, he says it's this kind of collapse that actually historically has created the greatest equality, right? And he talks about the various plagues, certainly, that overwhelmed the Europeans in the Middle Ages as having an enormous equalizing effect, right? As many workers died, there were fewer workers. Their labor then became more in demand, and people had to pay them more, right? So wages went up, and greater equality was achieved. And another source of greater equality for Scheidel is the mass mobilization wars, such as the World Wars, where nations like the UK and the United States raised income taxes significantly to over 90%, which had a significant equalizing effect in the face, of course, of catastrophic, threats, right? So if there's an upside to societal collapse or the threat of societal collapse, it might be that that's the kind of thing that finally motivates policy decision makers to perhaps ignore the whispers of the billionaires who are talking in their ears. Very quickly, then, what do the thinkers I talk about suggest? I'll just pick a few things because I could talk about this the rest of the evening. But one thing that many people don't know, I'll start with the New Testament. One thing that Jesus talks about in the Gospels is, and it's referenced. You have to do a little theology to understand what the reference is. But when Jesus is establishing his church, and this is recorded in the Gospel of Luke, he says it is the year of our Lord, which is a reference to the Leviticus law of Jubilee, which requires radical property redistribution, right? The book of Leviticus says all property must be redistributed back to an original equitable distribution once every 50 years. And then even in between those Jubilee years, once every 50 years, once every 7 years, or what the Bible calls a sabbatical year, all debts have to be forgiven. All slaves must be freed. All the slaves must be freed with ample money in their pockets. So those are some pretty radical suggestions, even in the Bible. Other solutions, right? I think Marx is kind of the most famous one with a solution, right? The solution is to overturn the economic order. Also pretty radical. But maybe the last solution I'll mention is from Plato, right? The first chapter of my book, because Plato, interestingly, has both a radical and a moderate solution to the problem of inequality. He says, ideally, he says, my radical solution is that we create a society in which the wealthy only have 4 times as much as the poorest people in society. And any money they earn over that goes back into the pile and redistributed to others. He says that would be the ideal solution, but he says that's if you're establishing a new colony, as Greek city-states could do back in Plato's day. He says if you're talking about a city that's already established, like Athens, for example, he says you need to work toward that 4-to-1 ratio, but you can't do it all at once, because if you do it all at once, it creates so much upheaval and a threat of societal collapse, right, that you might end up doing more harm than good. So what he suggests is getting buy-in from whatever portion of the rich are receptive to these ideas, right? And this, in America, this would be people like Warren Buffett or Abigail Disney. In Europe, this might be people like Madeleine Engelhorn in Austria, who's recently given away all her money. But rich people who feel that it isn't right they have as much money as they do, you appeal to them to reach out to those among them and to shame their wealthy peers into accepting higher taxes, some redistributive policies that work, as he suggests, gradually over time, incrementally, but also surely toward a much greater equality. So that's a moderate solution that's probably easier for most people to entertain rather than Marx's alternative of revolution. So that's just a taste of a few things.
Fantastic, thank you, David. Yeah, really interesting that last point about Plato, and a link, I think, to some of Peter Turchin's theory around an enlightened section of an elite in a given country recognizing things about to go south, so to speak, and deciding to take action to address it, as happened perhaps in the UK in the 19th century with the repeal of the Corn Laws and the Great Reform Act, for example. Karen, a question from an audience member. How would you suggest that we challenge institutions which eulogize meritocracy as a core value and use it as a shorthand for fairness without understanding the more complex connotations?
It's a really good question. I'm wondering which institutions, I think it's Sophie who's asked that question, and whether universities might be seen as institutions that eulogize meritocracy, perhaps. I'm not sure. I mean, maybe we'll talk about the perspective of institutions, higher education institutions. I think it's our job to support research and teaching which critically engages with this question, and we get really great research coming out of universities which shows that social mobility is greater in societies which are more equal. So if you do care about some kind of meritocracy, actually you want more equality in a society. So equality of outcome and equality of opportunity go hand in hand, and that's important. But also in terms of education and talking to our students about these challenges. And then in terms of us as an institution, how do we work to reduce gaps and barriers, but also critique the inequalities that we have across different educational institutions, because those are really fundamental too. So I think I'm answering this personally in terms of the educational institutions. Perhaps there are other institutions we might want to challenge too, and there certainly are a range of organisations that would take a very different view about this. But I hope that might be helpful on that question.
Fantastic, thank you. Luke, question for you in terms of existential risk and these issues. What kinds of modern policy responses to inequality do you think would be most effective at strengthening societal resilience? And are there any of the historical policy ideas mentioned in the book or elsewhere that you think we should revive today to boost civilizational stability, if you like?
So one large obvious one is taxation. The taxation system currently is not actually progressive. The average multinational corporation pays less tax than you and I would on a percentage basis. So a wealth tax makes a lot of sense. And while there's often these concerns around tax evasion going to tax havens, for instance, there's loads of different ways of addressing that have been written, including by Thomas Piketty and Gabriel Suez as well. So that would be a key one. I mean, one thing I discussed in my own book, Goliath's Curse, the history and future of societal collapse, is kind of what Karen mentioned, that it's also about preventing wealth inequality from spilling over into other forms of power. So I'm a very big advocate for deliberative democracy. I think if you have citizens' assemblies and juries across most policy issues, they're going to actually steer us away from wealth inequality. And I think in general, they're also going to make much better decisions as well. So I'd think about how do you level power, not just for wealth, but for other areas of power, including political power.
Great, thank you. David, looking to the future, as far or near as you like, how optimistic are you that humanity can get a handle on extreme inequality before it does become catastrophic? What gives you hope that we can reduce inequality and enhance resilience? But equally, what warning signs are you concerned about in terms of the greatest of all plagues, whether that's in the US context or UK or more broadly?
Yeah. So I'll start on the worrisome side and then work my way to the optimistic element. So yeah, obviously more countries experiencing significant inequality are flirting with authoritarianism right now. And I don't address this so directly in my book. Maybe I allude to it a little bit. But I think this is certainly easy to understand as a response to great inequality. There's a certain hopelessness that a lot of voters experience in the United States, and a sense of, what do I care if it collapses? This isn't working for me. Let's just vote for the man who's going to burn it all down. And this is not unique to the United States, right? As we that the AfD had a very big showing recently in Germany, and right-wing parties are continuing to do better. I think exploiting this very real problem, although maybe not in a way that's really designed to solve it in a sustained or positive way. What is it that? How might we address this, or what might give us hope that we can potentially find a better path? I mean, I think the greatest hope probably comes from, our past, right? That in the lifetimes of most everyone's grandparents, we acknowledged this was a problem, you know, in the 40s and 50s, and we significantly raised the taxes, right, that Luke had called for, maybe not in the form of exactly wealth taxes, but we've certainly imposed very significant income taxes on the wealthiest, right? And you know, George Harrison even wrote a song about it for the Beatles. He complained about it, but his life didn't seem to be that bad. He didn't seem to suffer too much from those taxes, right? And it created a lot more opportunities for others, right? Now, granted, what brought that about was a fear of, you know, being overwhelmed by, you know, the Nazis, which was a legitimate fear, right? One can hope that some of our experience in the past can you know, get us to this point where we pursue these policies without the immediate threat of Nazis. Although the aforementioned growth of right-wing movements, you know, makes me a little uneasy about all of about that. That they might force the issue on us, as it were.
Thank you, David. I'm going to end things there. I think we don't quite have time for another round of questions, although we could go on any of these topics, I think, for hours more quite happily. But thank you very much, David, Karen, and Luke, for your time today and your contributions. Thank you also to my colleague Jack Jeffrey for organising today's webinar, and thank you all for coming and for your questions. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.